Good afternoon, everybody, both in person and virtually, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. We are thrilled to have Senator Sullivan here, Senator Dan Sullivan here, to give us some remarks about Taiwan and our relations with China and our general relations in the Indo-Pacific. I'm Dan Blumenthal, Senior Fellow here in Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And again, we're thrilled to have Senator Sullivan, whose leadership on these issues has been really key even before everybody in Washington was paying attention. And that is because of his own personal experiences as a Marine when he was actually deployed and sent close to the Taiwan Strait in one of the crises or one of the, one of the activities that the Chinese were having in 1996, trying to intimidate Taiwan during a presidential election. He's been a senator since 2015 now, serves on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and has a lot of other experiences from Alaska with natural gas exports into Japan. Just a lot of very good experiences in the region, a lot of good perspective. And as anyone who is picking up the newspaper these days has seen, quite a lot going on in the Senate and in the House on Taiwan in general. But he's got some interesting ways to approach the question of deterrence and preventing China from actually attacking the island, and he'll describe that to us today as well. So we're going to go right into his remarks, and then we'll move to audience questions and answers, which you could send if you're virtual to us, and we'll get, and then I'll set the ground rules afterwards for raising your hand and calling upon you. So, Senator Sullivan, without further ado.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, and sorry we're running a little bit late. We had some votes going on in the U.S. Senate, but I really want to thank AEI for having me here today, and I've been a great admirer of this organization for many, many years. Arthur Brooks is a great friend of mine, now Robert Doar, Corey, Dan, everybody. It's a really great team, and I'm just really grateful to have the opportunity to say a few words, more than a few words, on a really important topic. And Dan, I've admired your work for many years. You've been a great leader on China policy, and we have a lot of work to do, and we look forward to doing that together. Today, I'm here to talk about a particular aspect of the China threat, and I know one that is close to your hearts at AEI, and so many people listening and tuning in from other places outside of Washington, and that is the intensifying Chinese communist threat to Taiwan and why it matters. And to be clear, that threat is increasing. Another issue I want to be clear on, there's a lot of discussion that I will be talking about today regarding the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, and that's where my focus is, not on the Chinese people themselves who have a proud history, heritage, and as we've seen over the last several weeks, very courageous, most of whom simply want more freedom. In March 2021, at a Senate Armed Services Committee, I asked the then Indo-PACOM commander, Admiral Davidson, how much time he thought we had with regard to a potential or likely Communist Party PLA invasion of Taiwan. You might remember the answer because it made news all over the world. He said, I think the threat of an invasion of Taiwan is manifest during this decade and in fact, in the next 6 years. Now that was almost 2 years ago that he gave that statement in front of the Armed Services Committee. The current Indo-PACOM commander, Admiral John Aquilino, has confirmed these concerns. And so, very recently, has the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the director of the National Intelligence Agency, the CNO of the Navy, even the Secretary of State have all recently talked about these accelerating timelines. On the heels of the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping has emerged, obviously, as the ultimate supreme leader, surprising even seasoned China hands with his audacity. He's packed the Politburo Standing Committee with loyalists, promoted party stalwarts with military intelligence and with military intelligence and technology, backgrounds, and position the Central Military Commission to preside over a conquest of Taiwan. Chairman Xi and his comrades might look rather ridiculous in these military fatigues. This is a recent picture they sent out. But the message of even this photo is clear, that China is preparing for war. Americans and the rest of the world should be taking this threat seriously. I know that our eyes are on Ukraine, something that we should stay focused on. Defeating authoritarian aggression in Europe is essential, not just for Europe's security, but deterring it in Asia. But we can't lose sight of the threat to Taiwan and what is at stake. So today, I want to lay out what a takeover of this island democracy by the CCP and PLA could mean for vital American national security interests and what we should be doing to deter it. But I'd like to begin my remarks by focusing on a different era in a different region of the world. In 1948, the Soviets cut West Berlin off from food and fuel. The United States and our allies, led by our military, responded with the Berlin airlift. The Allies flew in supplies literally around the clock, day and night, for almost an entire year. At the height of the Berlin airlift, a flight was landing literally every single minute. We and our allies saved West Berlin from absorption into the tyrannical Soviet orbit. Think about that. The United States military, our people, our institutions of government, even our citizens, despite being exhausted from World War II in 1948, understood the stakes in Berlin and why they mattered. And Americans now look back on that period of history, very famous photo there, as a point of pride for our freedom-loving nation. Years later, President Kennedy came into office, initially viewing the defense of Berlin as an irritant in U.S.-Soviet relations. But following his visit there in 1963, where he famously declared that he was a Berliner, he recognized Berlin, quote, as an asset, not a liability in the wider struggle for Europe and global freedom. The United States defended the city and the people of West Berlin during the 20th century because we understood that this city and its citizens stood on the front line of the struggle between an American-led free world and a powerful, expansionist, authoritarian regime. The same is true of Taiwan today. Taiwan is the 21st century's West Berlin. Now, it's not as if American leaders have disregarded the critical importance of Taiwan. To the contrary, starting in particular with President Eisenhower, there has been a long-standing, very bipartisan consensus focused on the security of the Republic of China on Taiwan. I have recently been rereading the excellent presidential memoirs from President Eisenhower. Oh, to have a president who intuitively understands instruments of power, grand strategy, and can cogently talk about them. One can dream, right? Read those memoirs. That's what you see. The importance of Taiwan and the significance and energy that President Eisenhower devoted to its defense is weaved throughout the pages of his memoirs. The focus, of course, has extended beyond the executive branch to Congress. At the darkest times for Taiwan, when the U.S. switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, it was congressional leaders like Senators Barry Goldwater and Bob Dole, as well as Democrat representatives like Lester Wolf, who worked in a bipartisan way to give us the Taiwan Relations Act. The Taiwan Relations Act is one of the most remarkable pieces of foreign policy legislation in the history of the United States Congress. A president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, wanted to abandon a long-standing ally, Taiwan. And Congress, in a bipartisan way, said, no. In the process, America's legislative body did several critical things beyond simply providing the basis for unofficial relations with Taiwan. Among them, Congress committed to the U.S. to considering any use of force against Taiwan a threat to the peace and security of the region and of grave concern to the United States. It declared that the U.S. decision to switch diplomatic relations from Taipei to Beijing rested on the expectation that Taiwan's future would be determined by peaceful means. And it committed the U.S. to providing Taiwan the means to defend itself and for the U.S. to maintain its own capacity to help. With this remarkable legislation, Congress laid down the law and policy on Taiwan for generations, including up to today. With the support, by the way, of a young senator named Joe Biden, who joined 84 of his colleagues to vote for the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979. These stalwart supporters of Taiwan, Republicans and Democrats, understood the stakes were more than just about the island itself. They encompassed the issues of American leadership in Asia and our commitment, like we demonstrated in Berlin, to prevent a communist power on the march from devouring an outpost of freedom, this time in the Pacific. Given this history, it's not surprising that the fate of Taiwan has been weaved in and out of the careers and professions of countless Americans, including my own. 27 years ago, I was a young Marine infantry officer deployed to the Taiwan Strait as a part of a Marine Amphibious Ready Group and 2 U.S. carrier strike groups, all in response to the Chinese party's aggressive military provocations on the eve of the presidential elections in Taiwan. The third Taiwan Strait crisis, this period is now called. That ship, which I think is in the boneyard somewhere, was the USS Bella Wood, and that was the ship that I was deployed on in the Taiwan Strait. This was an important and decisive demonstration of American commitment and resolve to an emerging democracy and partner that is still remembered in the region today by everybody. Many years later, on a CODEL to Taiwan led by Senator John McCain, I was asked by the newly elected president, Tsai Ing-wen, whether I had ever been to Taiwan. It was a question that kind of stumped me, took a minute to answer, and I said, well, yes, Madam President, I have been to Taiwan, but I've never been to Taiwan on the land. Many years later, I was part of another demonstration of an American commitment and resolve when I traveled to Taiwan just last year with Democrat Senators Tammy Duckworth and Chris Coons to provide vaccines, close to 1 million, for the Taiwanese people. We did this in the face of Chinese Communist Party aggressive actions to prevent the citizens of Taiwan from getting Western vaccines. That's a picture, actually, of the C-17 that Senators Duckworth and Coons and I flew to Taiwan on. And finally, for me, Taiwan has become a bookend of my Marine Corps career, where I currently serve as a colonel at Marine Forces Pacific Command under the Indo-PACOM commander. Here, the issue of a military crisis in the Taiwan Strait is a determined daily focus of our military leaders in this critical area of responsibility. And I will tell you from personal experience, these leaders are doing an exceptional job. As I mentioned, my first trip to Taiwan as a U.S. Senator was on a CODEL in 2016. I'll never forget getting on the bus and being briefed by a State Department official from our de facto embassy, the AIT there. Here's what he said. Welcome to Taiwan, a vibrant democracy of 24 million people with one of the most innovative economies in the world, a hub of trade and cutting-edge technology, And the only reason this incredible place exists on the map as such is because of the sacrifice and commitment of America, our military, our government, our people, to Taiwan's survival. All Americans should be proud of this. That's what he said. I remember thinking, wow, very powerful. What a powerful greeting. So American commitment and resolve on Taiwan has been part of our law, heritage, trade, economics, and military deployments for decades. But too few Americans, in my view, know this history and the reasons for this commitment. We need to rebuild this understanding to ready ourselves for the test of will that I believe is approaching. This starts with political leaders doing a better job of explaining to the American people collectively why Taiwan matters. In this regard, one question that I don't believe has been asked or analyzed enough is what would the world look like? And how would American interests be impacted by a PLA and CCP takeover, military takeover of Taiwan? So this is why, over the last several weeks, I have asked several different U.S. government agencies, many of the three-letter variety, and some think tanks and military commanders to help me think through this important but little studied question. And perhaps it's a little studied question because it's a difficult and depressing assignment to contemplate. The Communist Party, the PLA, launched a massive, multi-pronged, violent military invasion of Taiwan. And U.S. forces either do not get there in time, or do nothing to prevent it, or are defeated by the PLA in their attempt to defend Taiwan. None of this is something that you want to contemplate. Nevertheless, I believe it is our job as leaders to help Americans understand the ramifications of precisely this scenario in order to prevent it from actually taking place. A successful PLA military invasion and takeover of Taiwan would be a massive blow to the commanding heights of the technology and power of our digital age. Taiwan dominates the production of the world's most advanced semiconductors. Secure supply of advanced computer chips today are as important to our economy and that of our allies as the supply of oil has been for decades. Suddenly being deprived of them would have a devastating impact on the U.S. and global economy and likely millions of good-paying jobs in the Western world. Just look at the impact of the current chip shortage. According to the Commerce Department, in 2021 alone, the U.S. economy had a cost of $240 billion, including 7.7 million fewer cars being produced in 21 because of the current low-end chip shortage we now have. Those chip shortages continue, and as anyone who has visited a car dealership understands, we're seeing it to this day. But this isn't just an inconvenience for those in the market for a new car. It has meant the loss of thousands of jobs, manufacturing jobs in the U.S. Imagine a new scale of something like this. What would happen if the home of 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductor production, which is in Taiwan, was taken offline? It would cost us multiple times the $240 billion I just mentioned. All in all, conflict over Taiwan could cost the global economy, according to a recent assessment by the U.S. State Department, $2.5 trillion. Think about that. And this sum does not quantify the huge strategic advantage the CCP could gain if it seized the crown jewels of the global economy, which they want, and that's the fabrication of advanced computer chips. It would also present an extraordinary challenge to the U.S. ability in many ways to defend not only our interests abroad, but our own homeland. For this reason, Advanced microchips from Taiwan feed directly into our ability to develop and sustain our most sophisticated military weapons, F-35s, radars, missile defenses. This translates to greater risks to the men and women we send to defend and fight for us overseas. Second, there is the incredibly important geostrategic value that Taiwan plays right now that would be shattered by a successful PLA invasion of the island. In his memoir, President Eisenhower devotes pages and pages to Taiwan. At one point, he says, if the capture of Taiwan's offshore islands should in fact lead to the loss of Taiwan, the future security of Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and even Okinawa would be placed in jeopardy, and the United States' vital national security interests would suffer severely. Last year, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Eli Ratner, who I actually think is doing a fantastic job, made essentially the same point in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Critics rung him up for that, apparently calling Taiwan, as Assistant Secretary Ratner did, quote, a critical node within the first island chain and an anchor of a network for the U.S. allies and partners, risks offending Beijing's sensibilities. But Secretary Ratner and President Eisenhower, of course, were correct. Taiwan, in the CCP's hands, breaks China out of the constraints of the first island chain. What you see here is a line running from Japan through Taiwan and the Philippines to the Straits of Malacca. A CCP takeover of Taiwan has the potential to push the U.S. further east into the Pacific to what is called the second island chain. That includes American territories in Guam and Northern Mariana Islands. These aren't just some points on a grand strategist's map. Residents in Guam and the Mariana Islands are American citizens. They send representatives to Congress. Guam, as you all know, has an enormous U.S. military presence with tens of thousands of service members and their families. With the first island chain broken, this group of Americans, these strategic bases, could come under direct threat from an emboldened China with a massive and growing military. And it is highly unlikely that the CCP will stop at Taiwan. If history teaches us anything, it is that the appetite of an aggressive authoritarian regime on the march increases with each meal. For decades, the CCP has focused almost exclusively on building a military with the objective of Taiwan. Take a look at what Taiwan is facing across the strait in China's eastern and southern theaters. I won't go through the numbers, but that slide paints a very depressing picture. With a violent military takeover of Taiwan complete, the CCP will turn to another objective Eisenhower talks about in his memoirs, and that is pushing the U.S. out of the Pacific altogether and possibly invading or blackmailing other democracies in the region. Again, that military force right there has been focused on Taiwan. With a successful invasion of Taiwan, it's very unlikely that that force just stays put. It will be pressing throughout the region. According to the 2023 DoD China Military Power Report released just last week, some 17 countries are under consideration as additional locations for PLA military and logistics facilities, already building on the base that they have in Djibouti and the bases that they're scouting in other areas in Africa and South Asia. They can do some of this amphibious, ambitious build-out without taking Taiwan, but with Taiwan in their grasp, the effort will be supercharged. President Eisenhower was also deeply concerned about the impact a loss of Taiwan would have on American alliances and our ability to forcefully meet our defense treaty obligations with them. And that concern continues today. Japan, in particular, is too big and has too much history with China to simply make accommodations with the CCP, but it might feel the need to aggressively rearm and perhaps acquire its own nuclear capabilities. Presently, Japan is working closely with the U.S. on defense issues and has planned to devote 2% of its GDP to defense spending. This is something I and other American senators have encouraged. A military takeover of Taiwan by the CCP, however, could result in Japan questioning the U.S. commitment to its defenses, sparking more of a go-it-alone approach in its policies that I believe would not be in the interests of Japan or of the United States. South Korea might also make adjustments, having watched a successful military takeover of Taiwan by the CCP. The Republic of Korea could lose faith in the value of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence on the peninsula. Australia, after 100 years of mateship with the U.S., might also have to contemplate its security interests in the region. Same with countries in Southeast Asia, including treaty allies like the Philippines and Taiwan. Southeast Asia has dealt with a hegemonic China before. Its response was not a 19th century European one that did not seek to balance the Chinese empires, but it was a response to make the most of their fate as a weaker neighbor. Of course, it is always hard to predict the future, but there is little doubt that a Chinese communist takeover of Taiwan would call into question American alliance commitments by our treaty allies. It could cause some countries to build up their military capabilities, including nuclear deterrence, or choose a much more accommodating middle kingdom posture toward their powerful, aggressive neighbor. This should concern all Americans and our allies. The questioning of our Pacific network of alliances that has undergirded the security of the American homeland by balancing and deterring dangers far from our shores would make the United States less safe. Finally, a communist takeover of Taiwan would give a global boost to the CCP's model of authoritarian governance that Xi Jinping offers the world. In the 1930s, during a period of global upheaval, of which there are many striking parallels today, many around the world thought that the future lay with fascism. Such a future was alluring to millions. Democracy can be messy. Disagreements, sometimes ferocious disagreements, is the hallmark of representative government. And because of the transparency inherent in democratic governance, it is there for all the world to see, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The United States, along with other democracies across the globe, ultimately prevailed against the rise of fascism during World War II. It did so by the force of arms, but also by the appeal to the universal and immutable desire for freedom and self-governance. But a military takeover of Taiwan in the current global climate could lead many to believe that, as Xi Jinping has put it himself, the CCP's totalitarian vision offers a new choice for humanity, one that relies on techno-authoritarian control rather than self-governance. We cannot be blind to those implications or the extraordinary new legitimacy the CCP would gain at home and abroad. And with that would come new forms of CCP aggression throughout the world. So, I have a slide. The next slide has a summary of a number of these issues of why Taiwan matters. This was actually taken from a J2 slide deck out at INDOPACOM. But take a look at that. It sums up a lot of what I'm talking about, what China would gain, what the U.S. would lose. It's a good summary of the issues we've just talked about, and it's a good summary of why the issue we're focused on today matters so much to the security of the United States and the security of our allies. So my purpose today was to paint a picture of what the world would look like in the aftermath of a violent CCP military takeover of Taiwan. However, I just don't want to leave it here. The question, of course, is what is the best policy approach to prevent this? Of course, it's deterrence. To be clear, no one in America wants a war in the Taiwan Strait. And if one is launched, the United States will not be the aggressor. It will clearly be Xi and the CCP who start such a conflict. So enhancing deterrence should be a top priority of U.S. policy. And in my view, there are three ways in which we should be thinking about the deterrence of Taiwan to prevent a conflict. I like to talk about deterrence in terms of three levels. First, of course, is the level of Taiwan being able to defend itself, its own defense capabilities, which we are working hard on literally as we speak in the NDAA and other legislation that we are working on in the Senate right now. The ability to have weapons, the ability to defend themselves, the ability, as we are seeing in Ukraine, with an inspiring example of heroic people, to make sure a large, aggressive country doesn't easily swallow up a smaller one. That's the first level of deterrence. The second level of deterrence, of course, is America's capability and readiness to defend Taiwan militarily, should the president decide to do so. Over several decades, through many different crises in the Taiwan Strait, this layer of deterrence, where the United States military has shown up with significant force, has proven decisive in keeping the Taiwan people free. Our deep networks of allies in the region augment this very important, effective second level of deterrence. But remarkably, the third level of deterrence is rarely discussed. Yet it could be more powerful than the first and second levels. This involves employing the instruments of American power beyond our military, such as our global economic and financial strengths, to deter the CCP from an invasion. The communist leadership in China should understand that we are prepared to backstop any military response with debilitating economic and financial sanctions that go far beyond what has been imposed on Russia as a result of their invasion of Ukraine. This is why I've introduced the Stand with Taiwan Act and filed it as an amendment to this year's National Defense Authorization Act. The Stand with Taiwan Act will put the CCP and its military on notice that no corner of its economy will be left untouched by sanctions, from finance to trade to industrial capacity. And we will go after party members and officials themselves for aggression, casting a wide net. On CODELs that I've been on with many senators in Europe, London, the Netherlands, Japan, Korea, and other places, I've been pitching this idea to our allies. Imagine what we could do, this amount of GDP for the global economy, the United States and our allies, to be ready in terms of deterrence to sanction the Chinese Communist Party and critical sectors of the economy if they invade Taiwan. I think it could have an enormous deterrent factor. And one of the lessons that we have learned from the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine is that comprehensive economic and financial sanctions have the best chance of deterring a conflict when they are clearly articulated and ready to go before the conflict begins. At the end of the day, Xi Jinping, like all dictators, cares most about his own welfare and the welfare of the cronies who keep him in power. He has to know that if he moves militarily to conquer Taiwan, he and his economy that supports him would face devastating consequences, and that's what this legislation is focused on doing. Let me conclude with this. With the invasion of Taiwan, it is clear that we have entered a new era of authoritarian aggression like we saw in the 1930s. For nearly a century, American presidents have seen Asia and Europe as theaters that, if under hostile control, would put U.S. national security at extreme risk. Generations of Americans have fought and died so that East Asia and Europe would not fall under the dictatorial control of U.S. adversaries. Both of these theaters are at risk today. The free world cannot be neutral in this contest between freedom and authoritarianism, especially in the Indo-PACOM region. American alliances, power, and ingenuity helped build a world that provided more freedom and prosperity to more people than ever before. In fact, United States democracy, bolstered by our strong military, has done more to liberate humankind from oppression and tyranny. Think about the wars that we've had, starting even with the U.S. Civil War, literally hundreds of millions of people liberated, than any other force in human history. The Chinese Communist Party has clear plans to reverse all of this. It knows exactly what it wants to accomplish: to make the world safe for its tyrannical government, to profit off the export of its model to other countries, to separate America from our democratic allies, and to erode U.S. leadership. A world governed by Xi Jinping's totalitarian vision would be unsafe for America and our friends. And that's why Taiwan is so central to the future of the free world. It is a thriving, prosperous Chinese democracy that holds free elections with power bounded by the rule of law. For that reason, it threatens the CCP's central premise that one man ruling in perpetuity, by crushing all dissent, knows what is best for 1.4 billion people. The Chinese Communist Party has already crushed Hong Kong, once a bastion of liberty, and the free world barely raised a finger in protest. Should America and the world stand by as China does something similar to Taiwan, a peaceful democracy of 24 people who have voted for an entirely different future, that would not simply undermine the security of the Western Pacific, as the Taiwan Relations Act says. It would undermine America's role in the world and the values it has infused into it. And I believe it would deeply and adversely affect concrete American national security and economic security interests. I want to thank Dan and all our friends at American Enterprise Institute who believe in peace through strength for giving me the opportunity to talk about this important issue. And I look forward to answering any questions or learning from all of you on this very, very important topic for our country, for Asia, and for the world. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Over here. Oh, we got some questions already. Well, thank you so much, Senator Sullivan. We'll have audience questions. If we have about 20, 30 minutes for questions, so if you can raise your hand, wait for a microphone, and make sure you're asking a question.
I don't mind comments.
Okay. Well, I may be a little tougher on that one. Okay, and I'm also going to be reading questions off of, I'm going to be figuring out this new technology we have here with the people watching virtually, so we have a bunch of questions there too. But let me ask the first one. I'm not asking for permission, I'm the moderator, so I'm going to take the prerogative. So given the clarity and the very articulate way you've put forth in a deliberate fashion our interests, the stakes are extremely high, and I agree with you. And this goes back to the Eisenhower era, and there's continuity in all that. So given how high the stakes are, I mean, this battle between freedom and authoritarian governments, the first island chain, concrete interests as well as values, if you had some time with President Biden, who's now said 3 different times that we will oppose the use of force, we will come to Taiwan's defense. Would you advise him to expand upon that, to explain your three-legged, your very articulate three-legged, 3 layers of deterrence? Would you want the Chinese to know for sure that they will face the full force of the United States and its allies should they attack Taiwan?
So I think it's a really important question, and you know, one of the things that I've tried to do in my role on the Armed Services Committee, someone who spent a lot of time on these issues, is actually work with the Biden administration on a number of these topics. My view is that Xi Jinping's worst nightmare is a long-term, serious, bipartisan American foreign policy dealing with the rise of China. So, for example, just last week, I had a very long meeting with Assistant Secretary of Defense Ratner, who I think is doing a good job. I work with the NSC a lot on these issues. I had a meeting after a briefing with Secretary Austin just yesterday afternoon on some of these topics relating to Taiwan. So I think that's important. But when they're making mistakes, or when I view that they're undertaking policies that undermine these interests or I don't agree with, I also have no problem speaking out. I let them know and I let people know. The one thing that I think has been problematic with the president's pronouncements is they're not bringing clarity at all. They're bringing confusion, and that's a problem. When the President of the United States makes these comments about defending Taiwan, and then his staff and the White House on background or the press secretary walk it back, saying he essentially didn't mean that, nothing has changed, that just muddies the water, right? So what they need to do, if there's a serious change in the policy from strategic ambiguity, which is still, I gather, the official policy of the administration and the official policy of the United States on whether or not we would respond to a PLA invasion of Taiwan, they need to either make that 100% clear or they need to make it clear that the policy has changed. So what I've said to them is, hey, if you've changed the policy, come up and brief the Congress, come up and tell the world. But this idea of the president making statements, that's clearly seemed to be a change in policy, a big change in policy, and then his staff on background walking it back, saying that all that does is create confusion, and that is not what we need in the Taiwan Strait at all. So a number of my colleagues have come out saying we need to ditch strategic ambiguity. You may have seen some prominent think tank officials have come out and said that. I don't know where you are on that, Dan. The one issue, I have not come out and said I agree with that yet. And here's the reason why. And this is from talking to a lot of our military leadership in the region. The Chinese already believe that if there's a military invasion, we're going to defend Taiwan. I think that's quite clear. If you look at the history of our country, we've done that every single time. And so that kind of change in the strategic ambiguity posture right now, I'm not sure gains you a lot in terms of what they think is going to happen. The most important thing we can be doing, and this is where I am critical of the president and his team, is making sure on both that first level of deterrence, getting weapons to the Taiwan military, getting them good training, and importantly, that second level of deterrence. We have a strong military, a strong Navy that can come to the aid of Taiwan if that's what the president orders, that we do that. Right now, you've probably seen the president has put forward 2 budgets in the last 2 years that have shrunk the military and shrunk the Navy. 2 budgets that are cuts. And to me, that's not serious. To me, that emboldens the old men we saw in the fatigues in my slide deck there earlier. The most important thing we can be doing right now is rebuilding a very robust military. You may have seen in the NDAA, we added almost $45 billion to the top line, going from a 4.5% inflation-adjusted cut. That was the Biden administration's budget request to the Congress on our military, to a 4.5% inflation-adjusted increase. So to me, we need a little bit more of the Teddy Roosevelt approach, which is talking a little more softly and carrying a very big stick. That's the most important message we can be sending to the leadership in Beijing.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We have a question from my boss, Corey Shackey.
Yes, Corey.
Corey is, first of all, thanks you very much for coming here and giving that excellent speech. But in terms of some of the, you're introducing an economic bill, so you're clearly thinking about economic levers. You're thinking about them, as I understand it, in the context of being ready to go.
Correct.
In case there is more aggression. I say more aggression because...
Triggered if there...
Triggered if more aggression, right?
Triggered if there's a military invasion, which we define in the bill.
Military invasion, okay. What about using some of the levers that we have economically before that, or to shape the environment, or some of the things that I see Derek, my colleague Derek Scissors here, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission have suggested?
Well, look, I think there's a whole host of ones that we should be consistently looking at. This is where I give the Biden administration and the Department of Commerce some credit recently when they instituted the very significant export controls that came out about 3 months ago. Those are the kind of continuing economic applications that I think are needed writ large for the whole economic relationship between the United States and China. I've had legislation that's been focused on 100% the need for reciprocity, which, as you all know, we don't have it in our relationship at all. There's all kinds of things that the Chinese can do economically with regard to the United States and we can't do to them. We shouldn't tolerate that. So from my perspective, there's a whole host of things, to Corey's point, that I agree that you need to shape the environment on. The export controls, particularly as it relates to high tech, we need to start looking at. This is an issue where I've kind of diverted from some of my Republican colleagues, but I worry a lot about the American financial community, some of whom turn a blind eye to the challenges that with regard to China and are fully investing in things like AI, quantum computing, other elements of the Chinese economy that give them not only a leg up economically, but a leg up militarily. American investors, American private equity groups, American investment banks doing that. A, I think it's ridiculous. When I meet with CEOs who do that, I, let them know my view. But B, I'm seriously thinking about looking at, the possibility of legislation regarding outbound investment. It's a blunt instrument. It's not really where I want to go. But if you have an American investor class that seems to be fine with investing in advanced microchips and AI in China, that's a real problem. The Chinese don't do that in our economy, and we need to look hard at all of those things.
That's interesting. You're making me think of, so do we need to move to something more like Reagan had at the as he was coming into the Cold War late stages, and that was to actually impose economic costs on the Soviets in his case. But do we need to start thinking more about how to impose costs on the Chinese? I mean, an outbound investment review, an outbound investment restriction, other types of export controls we've taken actually have as their intent to slow down certain sectors of the Chinese economy.
Yeah.
Should we expand that sort of activity? Should we be thinking?
Well, I think it's both the combination of that, but also the combination of outcompeting them, right? That's what we've been able to do with every country in the world. We've faced big, strong, tyrannical regimes before, and militarily, but we've also been able to outcompete them with regard to a much more dynamic economy and to focus on and enhance our strategic advantages. Let me give you one where I'm very critical of the Biden administration on. That's energy, American energy. If you read the reporting, the Chinese leadership is very nervous about American energy dominance. And yet we have an administration that is more interested in going to Saudi Arabia and recently lifting sanctions on Venezuela to import more oil from those countries to the United States while they're shutting down the production of oil and gas in my state, in Alaska. It is literally insane, this policy. One of our great strategic advantages is our critical minerals, natural resources, and energy. And that is something we can compete with and have a huge strategic advantage with relative to the Chinese that we need to enhance, not unilaterally disarm on. And right now, this administration has been really focused on unilaterally disarming on those critical areas. You know, we have all this dependence right now on critical minerals, rare earths, with regard to China. We need to get off that dependence. And the good news is we have the capability in the United States with our own resources to do it. We just need our federal government to help us do it, not undermine our opportunity and ability to do it.
So just to follow up a little bit on this, it's clear, Xi Jinping is making it more clear that he intends to weaken us economically, to make us more dependent upon him.
Correct.
Do you think, though, that we need to move to a policy that actually weakens, that does what we can to actually weaken the CCP, that actually weakens the Chinese economy, or just outcompete?
Oh, I think it's a combination of both. And I think particularly when you look at, I mean, they laid out the roadmap, Made in China 2025. There should be policy prescriptions, whether it's our investment, American investment in those key sectors of their economy, or things that limit exports, like key technology, that make it much harder for them to compete against us and to limit their ability to have dominance, not just economically, but a lot of this dominance relates to military advantages. And that is something where we absolutely need to draw a line on.
Okay, if you have a question, raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Go ahead, yeah, right here. Russell Shao.
Hi, Russell Shao with the Global Taiwan Institute. Thank you, Senator, for your leadership on these issues. You noted in your remarks that you are pitching the ideas and the provisions of your Stand with Taiwan Act to allies and partners. Can you share a little bit about how receptive U.S. allies and partners are to these ideas? Could we expect similar legislations in other countries responding in similar fashion to the threats that you have laid out so clearly? Just some more insights from you on these conversations.
So right now my bill hasn't passed yet, but I'm confident it will. There's a lot of Democrats who are very interested in that legislation, a lot of Republicans, and again, it's a trigger. It's being very clear. It doesn't give the president a lot of waiver authority, it gives him some, but it doesn't even give the president a lot of waiver authority. It just lays out in terms of really what many believe might be the most important level of deterrence that we have to say to the Chinese Communist Party leadership, just so you're aware, if you undertake a violent military invasion of Taiwan, here is the economic cost that you're going to pay. And my bill is very comprehensive. So that's important. We weren't able to do that, as I mentioned, with regard to sanctions as they relate to Russia and Ukraine. Would that have halted that invasion? Nobody knows, right? But I think it has a much better chance of halting an invasion if you do that. I would say that different countries have different reactions. And of course, they would like us to demonstrate that we have the capacity to do this first by passing this law. I think in the next Congress, we have a good opportunity to do that. That's my prediction. It's my bill, so I might be being a little optimistic. But the point is one that they all generally agree with, that if it's not just the United States, but all of our allies, those countries that I mentioned that I've been to, if you include the entire EU, and I did pitch this to senior people in Brussels, you know, we're talking about 70, 75% of the world's GDP. I mean, that is a very, very significant deterrence hammer that I believe could do what we all want, which is to prevent a violent military invasion of Taiwan. So I would say I'm having different levels of interest. Some of them look at me a little bit wild-eyed, like, where did this Alaska senator come from and this bill? Others understand that this is a really important element of a deterrent factor. And what I've said to them is, you don't want a military invasion, right? Having more carrier strike groups, that's important. By the way, you may have seen, again, about 4 or 5 months ago, Indo-PACOM coordinated 4 carriers in the South China Sea. 2 US, Japanese, and UK. You saw pictures of that? That's impressive. That's deterrence. So having our allies involved in every aspect of these 3 levels of deterrence, in my view, is really important because it simply enhances the deterrence capability, and it sends a message to the Chinese Communist Party that it's not just the United States with our long history of defending Taiwan that's interested. The good news, I will say, is you're seeing other countries start talking about Taiwan and Taiwan security. You saw the G7 leaders, for the first time ever, mention Taiwan and Taiwan security. Japanese leaders are talking quite a lot about Taiwan and Taiwan security. That is all a huge change from even a year ago. So we'll keep pressing it, but I think our allies recognize that this is an issue that just isn't about, Northeast Asia. This is an issue that impacts the world, which is the point of my speech.
Let me ask sort of a follow-on, although I'm going to break my rule about making a comment posed as,
I welcome comments.
So arguably and I think the Biden administration has been pretty good about calling this out, Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin and so on. Arguably the Chinese are engaged in ever-increasing incremental uses of force across the Taiwan Strait every day, forms of coercion. You mentioned the Taiwan Relations Act. We have a Taiwan Relations Act, of course, which states that we're opposed to coercion, we're going to oppose coercion. Other countries do not.
Correct.
Right? And so oftentimes when I talk with my Taiwan friends, they say, this matters a lot because what level of force are we in the United States going to live with in terms of this ongoing coercion, and B, what's going to be very important to countries like Japan and others, the legal basis for pushing back against both coercion or something more extreme like an invasion. On the Russia-Ukraine scenario, obviously, it was clearly a break of international law of the UN Charter, which matters a lot to countries, the violation of a sovereign nation. Are there ways that the Congress can start to give authorities, like you're thinking about on the economic side, legal authorities to the president that other countries can also join in on?
It's a really important question, and again, I think on these issues, I want to give a compliment to the White House, Kurt Campbell in particular, and those, because they are very importantly starting to emphasize these issues of Taiwan security, economic coercion with our allies. And as I mentioned, like I said, the G7 leader statement referenced this, and that was the first time, and I think it's important. Our law is quite clear, and as I mentioned in my remarks, you read the Taiwan Relations Act, it is really quite remarkable what the U.S. Senate, was driven by the United States Senate, did, which was full disagreement with the president on a critical issue, and then kind of clearing the field and saying, we're going to set the policy. And so we're very clear on, as I mentioned in my remarks, what the Taiwan Relations Act mandates, requires, and gives us the legal authority to do, including arming Taiwan, including making sure, from our perspective, that any unification is done peacefully across the strait. I think it's a little bit harder for us to try to get other countries to do that, but on the diplomatic front, the ability to keep pressing it and having other countries raise it and senators raise it which I did. For example, I was on a CODEL very recently to the Netherlands. We met with the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the National Security Advisor, and I raise these Taiwan issues every time, including the Stand with Taiwan Act. I don't want to speak for the Netherlands, but you see countries starting to recognize that, hey, this is an issue that matters beyond just the United States and China and Taiwan and that region of the world. So I think we're making progress, and I do give the Biden administration credit for pushing that. But from a legal perspective, I'm not sure kind of what the next step is. My own view is that if you had a very, invasion like you had of Ukraine with Taiwan, that most countries would view that as a violation of international law and would hopefully react accordingly.
Good, thanks. Any other questions from the, okay, got one right here.
Hello, Senator Suzanne McCourt from the Australian Embassy. Thank you for your friendship with Australia, but also focusing on this important issue. My question is a bit about the domestic politics of this. There seem to be, as you say, an increased focus on these issues, but over and above your specific piece of legislation, how do you see the politics of this shaping up in Congress? Is there a common ground that is sufficient to actually get some broader action, or are there too many different opinions about how to deal with this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Suzanne, and we're very appreciative of your country and all that you're doing in the region, and I'm a big supporter of the AUKUS initiative, which I think also is a really important initiative for the region and for these issues, to be perfectly honest. I think, when I talk about the consensus that's starting to build on a building consensus on what we need to do to address the very aggressive authoritarian regime of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, I'm quite optimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic is if you just look at the trend line of what's happened really since 2017, and I give President Trump and his team a lot of credit coming in and saying, hey, this is a giant challenge, and the kind of establishment approach to this, China, and the threat it poses is no longer appropriate. So when you looked at the national security strategy of 2017 by the Trump administration, it was really good, and it laid out saying, hey, we know that post 9/11, right after 9/11, the George W. Bush American national security strategy was focused on violent extremist organizations not getting weapons of mass destruction, okay? In the aftermath of 9/11, I don't think anyone disagreed with that. The 2017 national security strategy from the Trump administration said, that's still really important, but we need to focus on the return of great power competition with China as our pacing threat. If you look at the Biden administration's national security strategy that came out recently, it's got a lot of things that I don't necessarily agree with, but the core of it is the core of the Trump administration policy. And the NDAAs that we keep passing every year, we're going to pass this one. I think the House just passed the NDAA today. We'll pass it probably next week. The core of the defense strategies that we are funding in the Congress are centered around this new national security strategy. I would say 90% of my Senate colleagues agree with the Trump administration national security strategy on reorganizing our focus on the Chinese threat. What's interesting is you see different countries, our allies, Australia, having their own awakening. Some are slower than others. I won't name names, but they're all kind of coming to their own awakening, and this is really positive. So one of the biggest areas of bipartisan agreement in the Congress right now is the challenge that the Chinese regime, particularly under Xi Jinping, poses, the serious challenge. Does that mean my bill will pass in a couple months? Probably not, but I have an interesting group of Democrats and Republicans that are already supporting it, but it's got elements, right? I mean, let's face it, a massive sanctions bill against China would cause a lot of economic damage, including here. That's why I think we need to continue to decouple our key supply chains with China, start doing what you're seeing in different parts of the country where Intel and TSMC are building massive chip manufacturing capacity here, not in Taiwan. But the trend lines on the bipartisan approach to China are positive and, in my view, getting stronger.
Okay, over here.
Thanks for your comments, Senator. A lot of the presentation and discussion afterwards seemed to focus on very high-level, big-picture themes. And what I'm curious about is maybe localizing a little bit. So one theme I picked up is adaptation, how we have to adapt. Another is sacrifice. Maybe we have to just give some things up economically, perhaps. But besides the financial sanctions, et cetera, I'm also from Alaska, actually, so I know Alaskans had to deal with a lot of cost during the trade war. So I'm wondering, maybe you could contextualize that from an Alaskan perspective. What do people have to adapt to or sacrifice in this preparation theme that you're talking about at a local level?
Well, look, I mean, my view on Alaska's role on our military and national security challenges is central. Central. You know, I don't want to do a big advertisement for the great state of Alaska, but when you look at our strategic location, when you look at what I call the 3 pillars of America's military might residing in Alaska, cornerstone of missile defense, all the radars, all the ground-based missile interceptors protecting the whole country are in Alaska. We're the hub of air combat power for the Arctic and the Asia Pacific with over 100 5th-gen fighters located in Alaska, tons of other military Air Force capabilities. No place on the planet Earth has 100 5th-gen fighters in one location, right? It's massive amounts of power that we've been growing. This NDAA, by the way, grows it more. And then having a key platform for expeditionary forces. We have a new Army Airborne Division. The 11th Airborne Division has now been stood up in Alaska that can deploy anywhere on a moment's notice to anywhere in Asia, in Korea, heck, in Taiwan. So to me, Alaska plays not only a key role in all of this from a military perspective, but so much of this is an economic one. And as I mentioned, particularly the areas that are vulnerabilities for the Chinese in terms of energy, natural gas. I just led a CODEL to Japan and Korea. We have an opportunity for an enormously large Alaska LNG export project that we've been working on, as you probably know, for years. That would be a hugely important economic, national security benefit, of course, to our state, but to our allies in Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan in particular, and to our country. So to me, we have an enormous role to play, probably one of the most important roles to play on all of this great power competition, authoritarian aggression that's happening. As you know, we're very close to Russia. And so my view is Alaskans understand their role with regard to the military and national security. They appreciate it. Does it come with risk? Yes, China's a big market for Alaska seafood, for example, Alaska natural resources. But I think Alaskans are very focused on freedom. And to me, this is a big issue that relates to freedom, not just across the Taiwan Strait, but much broader.
Thank you. We have to wrap up. I do want, you said something so critical that I just want to highlight about our commitment to peace and peaceful talks. And it's so important to highlight to all of our allies, Australia, Japan, and so on. President Xi Jinping has never once been called upon to negotiate with his counterpart, Tsai Ing-wen, peacefully and without conditions. And that's the cornerstone, really, to peace in the region. He's never had to pay a single diplomatic cost for that. He's met with her predecessor, Ma Ying-jeou, without preconditions, but he's never sat down and talked about the issues they have between them peacefully, never been called upon to do so either. But I do want to thank you very much. You obviously held this crowd on a Thursday afternoon. Excellent, excellent articulate speech. I wish you great luck. Anything we can do to help you with that legislation or any other types of legislation you're thinking about along these lines. Very articulate and keep leading on these issues. We really need you to do so. The country needs you to do so. And I just wanted to thank you so much for your
Great.
service.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here. And AEI, keep up the great work. Thanks, Tim.